Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our RCI Pod webinar series organized by ADB's Economic Research and Cooperation Department, and in this occasion dedicated to the topic of global value chain reshoring. In today's context of supply shortages due to COVID-19 and geopolitical tensions, the decision to bring back to the home country production activities previously offshored, also known as reshoring, has become a subject of debate in Asia and elsewhere. Supply chain management models are changing, trying to balance resilience and efficiency, and today's webinar intends to shed some light on this particularly relevant issue. To start our program today, I'm very glad to welcome first Dr. Yasuyuki Sawada, Chief Economist and Director General of the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at ADB, who will provide the opening remarks of the session. Dr. Sawada is Chief Spokesperson on Economic and Development Trends, and he leads the production of ADB's flagship knowledge products and support to regional cooperation fora. Before joining ADB, Dr. Sawada was professor of economics at University of Tokyo, and he has extensive research in the areas of development economics, microeconometrics, economic of disasters, and field service and experiments. Dr. Sawada obtained his PhD in economics from Stanford University. Without further ado, let me give the floor to our Chief Economist Sawada for his welcome remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roland, for a very nice introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. So welcome to today's webinar, Global Value Chain Reshoring. As we all know, expansion of global value chain has been among the main drivers of growth in international trade. Alongside the surge of foreign direct investment flows into Asia, the region's linkages with GVC began to deepen and rapidly evolve, driven by a steady decline in cross-border transportation costs as trade was liberalized and transport and logistics advanced. This latter logistic advancement included containerization, improvements in the regions of large container vessels, a virtual revolution in air transport, and modern communication, including information technology. Recently, the GVC landscape is changing as countries react and adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic, trade tensions, and other factors and elements. As such, economic and non-economic factors are increasingly important and impacting GVCs and business face up to the new challenges. Some of these challenges will make economic sense and others may be harmful. Trade tensions between the US and People's Republic of China and other frontiers have exposed many businesses to uncertainty around the security of their supply chains. Pandemic and associated disruptions to the supply of the key medical facilities and PPEs have alerted many policymakers to risks of supply chain disruptions and shortages of essential goods amid human and economic adversities. And recent bottlenecks in supply of semiconductors and microchips we observe are also posing growing and constant challenges to the production and automobiles and other electronic goods. Three driving forces are expected to characterize the global and Asian value chain landscape post-pandemic. First, momentum of globalization is likely to be revisited by many countries. Globalization will still progress and continue, but may do so in different shape. Second, supply chains are expected to undergo significant reconfiguration in order to minimize the risks from a potential disruption in the future. This could take the form of regionalization and reshoring and/or diversification of supply chain. Third, pandemic has accelerated digitalization of economies. Digitalization will continue post-pandemic, and cross-border trade and investment transactions will become increasingly dependent upon digital tools and real-time data, which will in turn affect the GVC landscape through the trade and investment nexus. More and more countries will certainly put greater emphasis on the risk management of their key supply channels, pursue reconfiguration of supply chain, and balance supply chain security against production efficiency. Many also anticipate a large number of businesses will rethink their current sourcing and outsourcing strategies and look to new strategies to minimize operational risks by streamlining, diversifying, and sometimes internalizing part of the significant proportion of their supply chain. While diversification and the regionalization of GVC imply relocation of parts of supply chain networks in order to enhance resilience in operations and suppliers and make use of geographic vicinity. Reshoring will adapt the re-engineering of domestic production capacity to bring production capacity back home at the cost of shortening value chain streams. In these backward linkages, a country could reshore the production of intermediate goods being imported. In the fourth linkage, it could also reshore the production of intermediate goods exported or assembly function previously outsourced to foreign economies. Importantly, not all reshoring motives are harmful. Technological advancements will naturally enable some countries to move up the value chain ladder and to onshore production stages. Previously outsourced production skills and capacities are upgraded. Prevailing adoption of robots and automation renders the cost of advantage of cheap labor less relevant to firms' production function. Having this said, if reshoring is made mainly to protect domestic industries and jobs beyond economic reasoning and against dynamic comparative advantage, it will certainly inflict efficiency losses. Uncertainty around the future of global value chain notwithstanding, Asian countries should navigate their challenges by adopting appropriate policy responses. For Asian countries whose economic development is particularly dependent upon trade and investment as well as value chain, the stakes are particularly high. So today's discussion about the importance of a global value chain, reshoring, and global, regional, and country-level responses couldn't be more timely and more important. With that, I'd like to thank panelists for today's sessions and all the participants participating in this webinar today. I'm looking forward very much to fruitful discussion. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rolando.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sawada, for setting the scene of our discussion and portraying the changing and sometimes complex landscape of global value chains and the implications for forward linkages. Let me now introduce our main presenter today, Dr. Yong Woo Kang, Principal Economist at the Economic Research and Cooperation Department of ADB. Dr. Kang has extensive knowledge and experience on policy and strategic issues. He was Senior Advisor to the Managing Director General of ADB and Senior Economist at the Strategy and Policy Department of our same institution. He leads the annual publication of Asian Economic Integration Report, and his research includes works on regional integration, inclusive growth, macroeconomic and international trade policies. Before joining ADB, Dr. Kang was director at the Ministry of Finance and Economy of the Republic of Korea, and he got his BA in economics and MA in public administration from Seoul National University and his PhD in economics from University of Washington. Many thanks, Dr. Kang. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Rolando. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so then let me start my presentation. I think our chief economist opening remarks have already laid a very good and solid foundation of today's webinar. And my presentation, and among the various scenarios of the global value chain reconfiguration post-pandemic, my presentation today will be focused on the reshoring case. As was also mentioned during Dr. Sawada's opening remarks, the trade conflict between the US and the PRC and on other fronts in the world have actually encouraged policymakers and the businesses alike to really think about the security and safety of their supply chains of their key products, also and to consider some reshoring policies and strategies. Recent events such as the lockdowns at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic also could cause companies to consider the reshoring as a supply chain management strategy as well. We have yet to examine how much disruption was made during the pandemic in 2020. So trade conflicts and then the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent disruptions to the supply chain, global supply chains, I would like to claim that even before these two events, policymakers and businesses alike started to revisit the rationale behind offshoring and outsourcing strategies, which have been mainly driven from the cost and operational efficiency perspectives. For one thing, for the middle-income countries, the technological progress has enabled many of them to move up the technological value ladder, and as a result, enable them to produce key intermediate goods themselves by internalizing some segment of the global supply chain instead of continuing to rely on the foreign imports. For the advanced countries as well, the development of technologies such as the robotics and artificial intelligence also motivates them to bring their production facilities closer to the customers, tailoring to and catering to the consumer preferences. I also mentioned this during the WTO's the Aid for Trade stocktaking meeting this year. For example, in the case of a German footwear company Adidas, when they announced their plan to withdraw majority of their offshoring, the production facilities away from China back in 2017, the basic rationale behind the kind of reshoring strategy was that because of the advancement of technologies, robotics and AIs, they now can produce footwears and other types of the products catering to the divergent customer preferences more easily than before. So overall, the concerns about the quality of products and services outsourced and offshore had also been at the center of the business's mindset. So in this sense, the COVID-19 pandemic and the trade war might have accelerated some motivation for the reshoring, but they might not have triggered it for the first time, as I would like to argue. In the future, we are of the view that the reshoring motive could still persist, although the exact form and magnitude could be difficult to predict accurately at the moment. But still, some reflecting on the vulnerabilities of global supply chains and some pitfalls with the just-in-time inventory management system, as opposed to just-in-case, and also some potential disruptions of the key segment of supply chains, like what was mentioned by Dr. Sawada during the opening remarks, the crunches in the production of the microchips and the semiconductors could be kind of the some rationale in pushing for the further reshoring activities by the businesses and countries alike. How to measure the progress of supply chain reshoring? One research I'd like to refer to is the LT Kearney, the consulting firm's the annual report, which showcases how much reshoring of the U.S. manufacturing sector has progressed for the past 1 year. In their 2019 report, they have shown that the U.S. manufacturing reshoring index has jumped quite significantly by 98 basis points, mainly due to the potentially the trade war between the U.S. and PRC. Actually, this measurement, this index is based on how much manufacturing imports was made by the U.S. manufacturing sector compared to the domestic output. So the imports from the 14 Asian countries are the basket which this report take into account. And then the sudden jump in 2019 is referred to having been driven by the trade war between the U.S. and the PRC. So another approach in estimating the progress of the reshoring is the survey-based estimation, so-called. We are presenting two examples here. The first one is the Thomas Survey Report, which was published August last year. And according to the report, around 69% of companies across North America, manufacturing industrial sectors are planning to bring some part of their production and the sourcing segment back to their own region. And another survey report by the Raconteur, which was published September last year, also find that around 66% of firms globally are considering reshoring to some degree based on the surveys of the global supply chain professionals. So another approach in measuring the progress of the reshoring is the so-called simulation-based estimation, which was conducted by the IMF through the World Economic Outlook 2019 version. Here, they have used the global integrated monetary and the fiscal model to estimate the impact of the reshoring on the various macroeconomic variables, including real GDP consumption and then imports for the advanced economies as well as the emerging markets. And then they assume that when the US and the Euro area and the Japan, three advanced countries or regions, reshoring is pursued in a way to lead to the decline in their imports by 10%, then how much the macroeconomic impact will be taking place to the advanced economies as well as the emerging markets. According to the estimation, simulation-based estimation, based on this assumption, the advanced economies will experience 1 to 2% decline in their GDP, and then another 0.5% of the GDP decline will be happening to the emerging market economies. And if you have a look at the left-hand side chart, they are considering two other variations. First variation is based on the yellow line. They have considered in case the multinationals, which are main drivers of the outsourcing and offshoring, in pursuing the reshoring, if the multinationals can try to squeeze some of the profit margin themselves to provide some buffer against the reshoring motives, then how much the macroeconomic impact will be happening to the advanced economies and the emerging markets. And as you can see from this yellow line, then this kind of profit margin squeezing efforts done by the multinationals could ameliorate a little bit of the negative impact on the countries, the macroeconomic performances. Another variation is the weaker technological division. As we all know, the multinationals in promoting the outsourcing and offshoring can also promote some kind of technological division, in particular to the emerging market economies. And then by pursuing the reshoring, the technological division effect, in particular for the emerging market economies, could be diluted or reduced. Then, as you can see from the red line, the negative impact for the emerging market economies could be even worse than the base case scenario. So far, most of the efforts to measure or estimate the impact of reshoring have been focusing on the trade and the macroeconomic performance channel or angle, leaving the upstream part of the how much the reshoring of the supply chain, value chain network itself will have an impact on the trade, export and imports. That part has been left as a black box largely so far. So using ADB's unique multi-regional input-output data table, we try to shed some light on this upstream part. When we introduce some kind of assumption about some portion, like that some portion of the supply chain are reshored, and how much impact will be happening to the export and import and total trade at large. So to illustrate this exercise, simulation-based exercise, I first would like to show some basic value chain decomposition pictures based on the MNEO 2019 data. As you can see from this chart, the red block captures the final and the intermediate goods exports under supply chain that can be reshored by home countries. This part is under the direct control of the exporting countries, so it could be main basis of the reshoring strategies for the countries and by companies. And then the dark blue block indicates intermediate goods export that are observed by partner or third economies. This is not under the direct control of the exporting countries, but it could be also affected by the reshoring, the strategy by the exporting country through third and second round spillover effects. And the light blue block is actually final goods exports, which cross-border only ones, which is so-called the domestic value added. So this will be increasing in tandem with the progress of the reshoring, because when the some part of the supply chain are replaced by the domestic production, this light blue part will increase instead. So based on this basic framework, we can also quickly have a look at the backward and forward linkage of the GVC picture. At the backward, the exporters export to the importer. Some portion of those exports could have been originally produced by importer, as indicated by the green line here. And when this green line, the value addition originally produced by the importer are reshored by the exporter, it will be displaced with the domestic production of the exporters. And as a result, the third and the second round impact will be taking place to the red line, which shows how much the third economy and the rest of the world are also linked through the value chain with the importer. And in the forward linkage side, the value addition originally produced by the exporter could have been exported to the importer, and it can go back to the exporter directly or through third economy or rest of the world, and going back and forth, crossing the border multiple times. This is so-called the return value added, part of which could also be reshored by the exporter and replaced with the domestic production. Again, through the spillover impact, third economy and the rest of the world could also be affected. Based on this, the framework, also using the MNEO, ADP's MNEO data. Yeah, so this chart shows how much impact will be taking place on the imports across different regions due to the reshoring scenarios. Here we are introducing three scenarios of the reshoring portion. First one is the 5% reshoring of the global supply chain, second 10%, and third 20%. And also we need to introduce another set of the assumptions about the domestic production capacity, because not all countries will have the full production capacity to fully replace, reshore the production facilities with domestic production. So in some extreme cases, some countries can have the 100% substitution rate, 100% SR, but other countries may have some less than 100% substitution rate capacity. So we are introducing three different assumptions of the 100%, 50%, 30%, and substitution ratio. So 3 by 3 assumption scenarios gives us a different length of the bar chart across different regions. But all in all, the European Union is expected to be hit the hardest among the different regions, followed by Latin America and then the Asia and the Pacific on the fronts of the imports. Moving on to the exports, we can see the more evenly distributed negative impact from the reshoring on the export front. But again, the EU will be hit the greatest among the different countries. So one salient point I'd like to point out here is that even when there is 100% substitution rate assumed based on the full domestic production capacity, still there will be negative impact on both import and export across different regions and globally because of some potential spillover effects taking place through the value chain linkages. So here we are showing the overall impact of reshoring on the total trade across different regions. Again, the EU is anticipated to be affected the greatest. The negative impact will be taking place to the EU because the EU region is very much closely linked with each other within the region. Due to the nature of the economic union of that region itself. And then Asia and Latin America follows the EU's case, and then the Asia and the Pacific and North America in that order. Moving on to the picture for the sub-regions in Asia. As you can see from this chart, Southeast Asia is forecast to be hit the hardest, followed by the Central Asia, then East Asia and South Asia and the Pacific and Oceania. The reason that the Southeast Asia is the hit hardest is that the Southeast Asia is the sub-region where the value chain linkage is quite deep within its own sub-region. Also, the sub-region has a very close value chain linkage with East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, as well as the European Union. That's the reason behind this quite significant negative impact taking place to Southeast Asia. And in the case of Central Asia, because many of the Central Asian countries are major commodity exporters, so their further linkage value chain could be hit quite significantly through the reshoring strategy adopted by the firms and the companies around the world. So all in all, based on the simulation scenarios, this chart tried to showcase the future trajectory of the world trade in goods and services growth. We have used World Bank WDI data for the 2010 and the 2020 historical trade data, and for the 2021 estimate, we have used the IMF's whale forecast. And based on this historical data, we have shown the baseline case scenario as indicated by the gray line, based on using the historical average data. But when we introduce some scenarios such as the 10% reshoring across the board, then we can see for the next 5 years or so, there will be quite a significant moderation of the global trade in goods and services compared to the baseline case scenario. When it comes to the 20% reshoring scenario, even further decline of the trade will be taking place. And then from this estimation trajectory, what I can say is that there's some break-even level of the reshoring percentage, which can lead to the even negative growth of the world trade in goods and services could lie somewhere between 10% and the 20% reshoring scenarios. So lastly, I'd like to quickly showcase some different impacts forecasts across different industries. As you can see from this chart, when we assume the 5% the reshoring of the global supply chains, then the high-end medium tech, the manufacturing sectors will be hit harder compared to the low-tech industries and also the primary sector. This is because the high-end medium tech industries have a very close value chain linkages and deep linkages as reflected into the complex value chain linkages indexes. So whenever there is some kind of reshoring, the progress that taking place, the quite significant impact will be happening to the high and medium tech industries and their exports and imports at the same time. And when it comes to the service sectors, as you can see from the right-hand side chart, most of the logistics-related service sectors will be hit harder than the other service sectors like the real trade and real estate activities. And then the Asia's case, overall, the left-hand side, we are showing the impact on the Asia's exports due to the reshoring scenarios. And on the right-hand side, the imports. And overall, as you can see, the Asia's exports will be hit harder than the imports overall. And again, the high and medium tech industries of Asia's exports will be hit more significantly, more adversely than for the low-tech industries and the primary sectors. And in the case of services, quite the significant heterogeneity we can observe, even under the 5% reshoring scenario. Some service sectors will go through more than 10% decline in their exports and imports, while others will just suffer less than 2% of the decline in their exports and imports through the value chain linkages across the border. To conclude, recent events such as the trade conflicts and the COVID-19 lockdowns and the subsequent supply chain disruptions have prompted many policymakers and businesses alike to reconsider the security of the supply chains and and they have come to some motivation to pursue some types of the reshoring as a mechanism to mitigate the adverse effects of these trade shocks. I'm not saying that the reshoring motive will be the sole dominant factor to characterize the future of the GVC landscape. There are certainly many developed countries which are trying to deepen their GVC participation through their industrialization process. But depending upon which forces will be greater between these two, the future picture of the GVC landscape will unfold. And I think that we'll have to see where the future evolution of the GVC will take us. Using the ADB's unique MNEO data tables, we have simulated when we introduce some kind of assumptions about the share of the supply chain to be reshored, then how much impact will be happening to the global trade across different regions and across different sectors. And around 5 to 10% of reshoring of the global supply chain will lead to 5.3% to 13% decrease in the global trade from its base value. Alternatively, when we assume the 10 to 20% of global supply chain reshoring, it will lead to 13 to 22% of the decrease in the global trade overall. Lastly, the impact will be heterogeneous, as I have shown to you, across different sectors and different regions, depending upon the depth and breadth of the supply chain linkages of those sectors and the regions themselves. So let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kang, for this overview, and also on the motivations and strategies taken by Asian countries towards reshoring, the possible ways to measure it, and also leaving some interesting points to use for our discussion. We can now move to our panel discussion, and we are delighted to welcome a very distinguished group of panelists that we hope will enlighten us on some of these issues. I would like briefly to introduce each of them. Our first panelist is Roberta Pierre Martini, Chief of Trade Cost Analysis at the World Trade Organization. Roberta has more than 20 years experience on trade policy, and inclusive development, and she's the lead author of the World Trade Report and several guides on trade policy modeling. She has also served as WTO dispute settlement in several panels and arbitration cases. And prior to joining WTO, she was a lecturer in economics and statistics, and also in the research division of Corf Industria. And she holds a PhD in economics from University of Southampton. Our second panelist is Yeoki Min, a research fellow of the Korea Institute for Industrial Economics and Trade. Yeoki has worked in the areas of digital trade, global supply chain, reshoring, and industrial cooperation. And prior to joining KIET in 2008, Yeoki worked on the Joint Secretariat for Economic Cooperation between the Republic of Korea and Indonesia. He holds a master's in economics from Sungkyun Kwan University and a PhD in economics from University of California, Irvine. Our third panelist is Claudia Trentini, senior economist in the investment research branch of the Division on Investment and Enterprise at UNCTAD. She's part of the team that produces UNCTAD's flagship publication, the World Investment Report, and her areas of expertise include M&E's internationalization strategies, their impact on host countries' economic growth and development, infrastructure investment, FDI, and SMEs. Claudia holds a PhD in economics from the European University Institute. And last but not least, our final panelist is my colleague, Pramila Krivel. She's an economist at the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at ADB. Pramila's main fields of specialization are applied econometrics in international trade policy, regional trade agreements, trade negotiations, rules of origin, and non-tariff measures. Prior to joining ADB, she was assistant professor at Goethe University in Frankfurt, and she has worked extensively with several institutions, including UNCTAD, WTO, and European University Institute. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Geneva. So with this very strong panel, we hope to have a great discussion, and also please feel free to reflect some of your thoughts following the presentation by Dr. Kang. So please let me start with Roberta on our first question. Perhaps just to kick off the discussion, is reshoring an adequate policy response to ensure the supply of essential goods from the perspective of less developed countries and developing economies? And if so, what are the possible strategies? Thank you, Roberta.
Thank you, Orlando. Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for this invitation, and congratulations to the ADB for their publication on reshoring. This is the topic of the moment, so is very timely, and I think any debate on this issue at the moment is very important, because it's going to be the driver for trade policies in the next, at the moment and in the next future. And we at the WTO, we are currently working on the next Water report, which is about resilience. And in this context, we sort of also tackled with the issue of reshoring. And one key point I think to make when we discuss this is that somehow there is the idea that there is a trade-off between efficiency achieved with international specialization and trade, and resilience, or sort of somehow a way to prevent risk or deal with risk that instead requires some nationalistic policies and reshoring. And what we highlight in the report, that this is a false debate. Trade can be a factor of shock transmission, so it can be a source of vulnerability for countries, and sort of this risk has to be taken into account. But yet, and what this crisis has highlighted, that the trade is at the same time a tool to cope with the crisis, and not only also to prepare eventually, and also to recover quickly from a crisis. So when discuss the issue of reshoring, is I think it's important to take into account that what is the issue, policies that push reshoring at the expense of international trade can actually reduce economic resilience rather than increasing economic resilience. So trade inevitably, sort of restriction to trade inevitably lead to less efficiency, and can also lead to retaliation. What we see is that with the reduction of trade costs over time, the volatility of GDP has decreased over time. So the debate is not the correct debate should not be about using trade policies that favor domestic production relative to international trade, because international trade is also a way to cope with the risk, to prevent and to quickly recover from a crisis. The alternative to this would be promote diversification, meaning also geographical diversification, sort of a variety of sources from which you source your inputs, and a variety of destination market where you sell your product. Now, in this context, diversifications, policies that support diversification, may also include more production domestically. And diversification could also be diversifying partially at home. But the big difference with what we commonly understand as reshoring is that we will not be talking about trade policies that are restrictive, but on the contrary, policies that reduce trade costs. And in this context, even to the extent that sourcing from domestic production is a form of diversification, that will also help resilience. So So diversification policies aiming to reduce trade costs is an alternative and a valid alternative, and also more cooperation. Cooperation meant in the form of, for instance, greater transparency, information sharing, with more predictable global market can help to somehow have a better information about the production capacity, information about where the bottlenecks of global value chains are. Cooperation could help to manage inventories. We have seen it in the current crisis, what the EU has done to prevent excessive stockpiling. And in general, facilitating cross-border trade has been an element important in the current crisis to allow the functioning of supply chains to quickly, to stay in place. And to quickly resume when the conditions allowed it. And with this sort of distinction between what we commonly think of reshoring, we're introducing, accompanied with policies that actually give an advantage to domestic production at the expense of international trade, and in opposite to a policies that instead promote diversification. Is this where the debate should be? And with this, I stop here.
Thank you very much, Roberta, for pointing out this important point and this false analogy, as you mentioned, between the trade-offs of reshoring. That's a very interesting point. Let me now move to Ioki and to continue on the same point. Together, if we consider if reshoring is a good alternative or policy, or if it's adequate, the way how we introduce reshoring is also very important. And there are different ways in which that can be pursued. For example, one is such that domestic suppliers substitute or make up for foreign suppliers, and directing foreign direct investment to ensure the expansion of domestic capacities is one of such ways. One example of this is what we saw with the Biden's administration strategy to bring Samsung semiconductor facilities in the US to reduce the reliance on foreign suppliers. What are, in your view, the possible approaches to reshoring today, and what opportunities do you see for Asian firms in this context?
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. I thank, first of all, you for giving me a chance to participate in this valuable seminar, and also thanks to Dr. Kang for the presentation. Regarding your question, as other speakers already mentioned, I also think that recent reshoring policies in major countries are very closely related to supply chain reconstruction. In addition, COVID-19 pandemic is further intensifying these changes. Methods for securing domestic supply chain can be divided into three categories. First one is to foster related domestic companies. The second is to actively attract foreign direct investment. Last is reshoring, which allows the companies that have entered overseas to return to the domestic. Of course, which method to use is determined by the industrial structure and industrial production capacity of each country. For example, in the case of country with certain degree of industrial capacity in its own countries, all three methods are available. On the other hand, countries that do not have their own industrial capabilities may face a crisis and have no choice but to rely on foreign direct investment in the short term. In the mid and long term, fostering domestic industry can be another option. I think such countries should foster core industry through selection and concentration strategy based on their limited resources as efficiently as possible. Let me think of reshoring from Asian companies' perspectives. First of all, I think reshoring by global company is clearly risk for Asian countries and companies, because global companies will relocate production facilities to their home countries. It will directly impact on production, employment, and growth of Asian countries. However, at the same time, opportunities also exist. Reshoring does not just mean returning to one's home countries, but also moving to neighboring countries. In fact, some of United States companies are relocating their production facilities to Mexico. For instance, Boeing decided to nearshore its aircraft wiring plant to Mexico in 2020. The transfer of production facility to neighboring country is made for various reasons, such as management efficiency and trade agreement. And through this, a regional production network is established. In other words, Asian countries must also accurately recognize these changes. Major countries, including major Asian countries, are highly likely to establish new regional production networks centered on Asia, which will be an opportunity for Asian countries and companies. As far as I know, the Japanese government provides the same support to companies moving production facilities from China to Asian countries as companies reshoring them back home. So this is an example. And therefore, Asian countries and companies must increase their values and attractiveness to take advantage of these opportunities. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yaki, for putting into context some of these different strategies and also what Asian economies are currently looking at in terms of reshoring approaches. Now, let me move to Claudia for one first question that follows up nicely on what has been discussed. Even before the pandemic, we talked about different alternatives, and your 2020 World Investment Report discussed some of these in detail, the diversification mentioned by Roberta, nearshoring, as was mentioned by Yoki, and it's a delicate balance between these different strategies. So what opportunities and risks do you see in these different policy responses? And beyond trade, what other effects or possible implications do you see in areas such as, for example, employment or innovation or even investment?
Yeah, thank you, Rolando, and thank you for inviting me here. I feel a little bit an outsider talking about M&Es and investment perspective. But yes, this is the work we developed last year in the World Investment Report. And also this year we further analyzed the cost implied with relocations rather than diversification. What we did is trying to have a characterizations of the different GVCs by industries to have an idea of the cost and the benefits multinationals have in pursuing one strategies rather than the other one. Of course, as Roberta already said, diversification is actually mitigating one of the main risks coming from major shocks like pandemics or trade wars or kind of a big systemic risk. And it is the one of concentration, whereas reshoring mostly addresses the risk of geographic and interdependent risk of a value chain. So it is an available strategy and offers opportunities for more countries to enter and more economies to enter the global value chain. however, is mostly suited for companies which are active in the services sector or in not capital intensive sectors. Why this? Because of course capital intensive industries where you have a very high sunk cost and you rely on economies of scale don't have the incentive to or it's very costly to reshore, to close up facilities and open new ones and to replicate. So you are foregoing basically economies of scales to do that. And you have a lot of costs to reshore and close up facilities on top opening up new ones. Whereas lighter industries and services where you can take advantage of digitalization to efficiently manage your supply chain and the facilities, manufacturing facilities are not really so asset heavy, or in the services where through teleworking or platforms, you can basically work from all over the world and contributing to platform networks. These are the most likely to be using this diversification strategy together with kind of pharmaceuticals or medical devices which are might be required by host countries to open up local facilities and where basically the major investment is in the R&D at the top of the chain, whereas the truly physical production is rather standardized and relatively lighter as an investment. So these are the industries which are more likely to participate, opening up to diversificate, opening up possibilities for new countries and new economies and also smaller companies to enter the value chain. This is, of course, it needs to be supported by digitalization, by some infrastructure, digital infrastructure, to be taken as an opportunity by new potential host markets. Also, what host markets can do to take these opportunities is to invest in a system of SMEs, not only specialize in a single task, but offer basically a system of suppliers that are able to enter these more flexible value chains. The risk is that for intangible goods, services, platform networks, the value added is captured by the leading MNEs often and economy, so leaving less room for new members and contributors to capture some of this value created in the supply chain. And for this, government and policymakers need really to act and invest in technology and knowledge, flexibility, to be able to fully participate in this new chains. The other strategies, nearshoring, my colleague already explained. Basically, it combines some advantages of this diversification as it moves out from one single supplier manufacturing Asia to come closer, as he said, with the example of Mexico. And on the other side, it also has some disadvantages of the reshoring, like the costs are still there. So even if maybe if there is a regional trade agreement which can be exploited, can of course reduce the cost of reshoring. So is a halfway strategies, but in our eyes is mostly associated with reshoring, so it doesn't really bring and it's not a really new type of restructuring of the global value chain.
Thank you. Yeah, that provides a great background to understand how these reshoring strategies impact MNEs, both from, as you mentioned, cross-sectoral and also from a vertical perspective, and who are also the winners and losers in some of these strategies. Let me now ask my colleague Pramila. We have discussed already some of the different approaches and strategies and the incentives that economies have to go for one or other approaches. Perhaps one question would be how does the work we do? We are within ADB tracking and following all the progress in regional integration, and in particular in regional trade agreements. How do they interplay with reshoring policies and diversification strategies? What are the linkages between reshoring, diversification, and regional trade agreements?
Thank you, Rolando. Thank you for this interesting question. And indeed, I think it's the core of our work here in our division of regional cooperation. So let me start by saying that I believe that regional cooperation is a key component to enhance the resilience of supply chains, and it can operate in various ways. I will focus here on two aspects. The first one is that it contributes to the resilience, the resilient restructuring of global value chains. So this is what we have already a bit discussed. So I'm going to echo what also has been said, but I will try to avoid overlaps. So by reducing the trade costs, obviously, and enhancing the market access opportunities. And a second aspect is also that regional cooperation and trade agreements, they reduce uncertainties and risks through the applications of clearly defined trade rules agreed among parties. And so let me just mention the first element, the restructuring of value chains. So it has been explained that it's mostly about either reshoring, nearshoring, or diversification. So something that is quite interesting with trade agreements and regional cooperation, I believe, is that depending how it is designed, it can promote all the aspects at the same time. Because if you have regional trade agreements with regional partners, you reduce the trade cost in exporting to regional markets, you reduce the trade cost in sourcing your intermediates from regional markets, then you kind of promote reshoring policies. But at the same time, depending what type of agreement you have, if you have only one single bilateral agreement, then obviously you don't promote diversification. But trade agreements, usually they are not just, it's not just one. We know that you have a proliferation of trade agreements, and when a country starts signing bilateral deals, usually you sign more and more. And so in that case, you can also promote diversification. And we also know that in addition to bilateral agreements, we have now a renewed interest for plurilateral trade deals, mega regionals. This is the case with our SAP, with CPTPPs. And I think this is also good news because it can help achieve the right balance between diversification and nearshoring policies, or through regional cooperation, while minimizing the costs. And it has also been mentioned by Roberta that it doesn't mean, it's not because we diversify that we don't produce domestically. And we also need to keep in mind that trade agreements can also generate trade creation. And with trade creation, then you can diversify your market, the export market, your sourcing countries, and at the same time increase the domestic production. And finally, the second aspect about reducing uncertainties and risks. Well, with regional cooperation, you can support strengthen the capacities of GDCs to absorb shocks with this common set of rules. It can be rules that are defined in the agreements. I'm thinking here, for example, of root of origins, which is I'm going to talk maybe more about it later. But also simply, it depends what is the content of the agreement. But if we think that you may have some sort of agreements on TBTs, on SPS, or things that support harmonization, it promotes flexibility. And I believe it's very important to talk about diversification, not alone, but also it's especially in the case of crisis like a pandemic, you don't need just diversification, but you need also flexibility. What I mean is, if you have a wide source of a wide network of sourcing countries, with a pandemic, it's not only one that will be affected. Mostly, a large portion of, despite the diversification, a large portion of your supplies may be affected. So you would also need to have this flexibility of being able to, to switch from one supplier to the other one. And in that sense, having a common set of rules might be important, especially standards. So, yeah, and also about trade facilitation in trade agreements, and that has already been mentioned by Roberta, facilitating cross-border trade is also included in trade agreements. And I think it's also promote diversification. So I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Pramila. And that provides a bit that's our bread and butter every day. We work on these issues from our division, and it's useful for us to put it in that context. Let me now go back to Roberta and maybe refer to the presentation made by Yong Woo and some of the findings that also to know what are your thoughts on these hypotheses and the findings, and also on the fact that there is the existence of costs to reshoring. So it's not a free lunch. There are costs to reshoring, and sometimes you have to balance between the associated costs and the reduction in certain types of risks, maybe not all risks, but some. What are the policy efforts, or what policy efforts should be made to manage this associated cost and maintain the momentum of global trade? Over to you.
So very interesting discussion. So while there were all these, I mean, a lot of issues were introduced by all previous presenters, and I would like to sort of maybe go through some of the elements that came up and reinforce some of them. So, as you said, rightly so, the report, Yong Woo have highlighted the cost of reshoring policies. And I quite like Young sort of structuring in three types of policies. And I think when you look at the three types of policies he highlighted, being increase in policies that increase production, attract FDI, or recall multinationals back home. When you look at each of that, you can probably clearly highlight a specific cost. When you sort of increase production domestically into a sector that normally would not be the most efficient sector, you have clearly a cost of efficiency. But also, sometimes we forget that there is another cost that is making the country also more vulnerable to domestic shocks. And we forget that shocks are not just coming from outside. For many countries, least developed countries especially, they come from inside. And that really has got a clear cost in terms of increasing vulnerability. When we look at attracting FDI, yes, FDI is clearly a way to also, in a certain way, so increase production in sort of competitive way, attracting FDI and technologies from outside. Let's not forget that sometimes in countries out of even Latin American countries, for example, sometimes can turn out to be a race to the bottom competition across countries to sort of get sort of the right environment for attracting FDI, sometimes at expenses of sort of the right fiscal policies, for example, in a country. We've seen what's happening now among G7 countries that are trying actually to fight this race to the bottom, and the intention is to try to get taxation policies that somehow avoid that, or at least put a floor to this race to the bottom. So there are other issues that come with it. And when you recall multinationals back home, you're actually sort of giving up a source of growth, or that growth channel that is that of technological spillovers that are essentials. They're essential. I mean, the key element of global value chains, and have been an important factor in the growth we have had in the last 50 years in the world. I totally agree with Claudia that services is and supported by digital innovation is the sector where diversification will occur, and a great opportunity also for developing countries, and to the extent we address access to digital technologies as an issue. And another issue that comes with them is the possibility that because of their nature, these digital technologies create sort of issues of competition. These are characterized by the winner-take-it-all type of dynamics, so that there is an issue, which is a global issue, because digital technologies are global in nature, that needs to be tackled. So, and with this, I sort of link to Pramila and the idea of using regional trade agreements as a tool to diversification. Clearly, that's the policy. Many governments are doing this. There is a sense that among your neighboring countries, there is more trust in case of shocking heat. So you can diversify at the same time have a sort of set of countries on which you rely in case of shock. Clearly, there is more limited technological spillovers. There's also a little bit of an issue that countries within a region often are in the same business cycle, so that if a shock hits a country, often is the region that is also hit, in which case it may not necessarily be a solution to get out of the crisis. What you would like is diversification, meant a bit what we do in portfolio with countries that are in different business cycles, so that will really reduce your the risk. And that's why we're moving in some countries to mega regional. But as we move up, what I like to stress is there are some issues that, and specifically in the context of crisis, in the context of current digital technologies, they're inherently multilateral in nature. When you in a recovery phase, what's happening? We've seen it in the financial crisis. We've seen it in the current crisis. What's happening is massive use of subsidies, and the subsidies are not a regional issue or a global issue. And I think what is clear is probably that the need that we somehow, in the context of WTO, we re-examine subsidies rule, given the importance they have in building and supporting economic resilience. And in the context of digital technologies as well, these are global issues. At the WTO already there are negotiations going on electronic commerce to facilitate the digitalization of trade. E-commerce has proven to be essential in coping with the crisis, keeping trade going beyond keeping people at work. But there are issues that, I mean, there is an issue of infrastructure, regulatory issues, and digital divide that will have to be tackled both at the with national policies and with international cooperation. Maybe I stop here, otherwise it's too long.
Thanks a lot, Robert, and thank you for summarizing and giving a lot of coherence to what has been said so far in the discussion. And I liked a lot the point on the domestic shocks and also the kind of diversification similar to the financial diversification to make shocks less impactful on regions. Now, let me just go back to Ioki and continue on the discussion from Asian perspective. We see that there are some of these strategies being considered. What kind of government policies could make these reshoring-related industrial transitions smoother? So we see that there are some drastic measures or transitions. How can we make these transitions smoother? And do we have any country examples in the region that maybe it's worth mentioning?
Okay. Basically, it is not easy question to answer. Up to date, a number of countries are pursuing policies to prepare for reshoring. Most of them are to safely establish the supply chain of their core industries. It is not easy to find completely new policies, yet how to smooth industrial transition. Although reshoring is being actively promoted in many economies, this reshoring does not occur in all industries. Actually, Dr. Kang also explained heterogeneous impact across sector in his presentation. So the important sector is core industries, strategic industries, and high-tech industry. These industries are the main target of reshoring of the major economies. I think policy of Asian national level should be pursued in two directions. One is a policy to participate in the establishment of a regional production network. And the other one is to foster an industry with comparative advantage or attractiveness internally in specific industrial areas. Considering Asian countries' market size and production capacity, Asian countries cannot internalize all the processes in the supply chain like United States or China. Therefore, it is desirable to promote an active participation strategy when the Asian regional supply chain is established. And for this, the government efforts are required. Government effort may, first of all, provide various types of incentives to companies participating in the supply chain. In particular, for companies participating in supply chain, the promise of government to prevent production interruption or deviation from the supply chain due to political reasons is an important determinant factor for foreign companies that wants to establish a regional production network. In addition, Asian countries need to expand the advantage of domestic production by promoting and improving free trade agreement with major Asian economies. It has already demonstrated in the United States case. The USMCA's push results in increasing the incentives of US companies to produce in Mexico. Internally, it is necessary to expand and strengthen the comparative advantages of a domestic industry and secure advantages in the relevant field by promoting digital transformation. Strengthening the comparative advantage of domestic industry is possible through industry promotion policies. Claudia already explained and emphasized before. The point I would like to emphasize here is the need to promote the digital transformation of industry and economies. In fact, since the development of digital technology is driving force of industrial development, it will be difficult to accept the evolving technology without digital transformation of industry and economy. And it will be difficult to survive as a major partner in industrial production or participant of GVCs. Actual digital technology can be quickly adopted and developed according to the country's readiness for digital transformation. Therefore, it can be said that support and investment for digital transformation are necessary right now for Asian countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hioki, and that stresses even more the point on digitalization, digital transformation, and regulatory frameworks for digital infrastructure to be developed. And that's something that I think most of the panelists agree. I'm conscious of time, so in the interest of time, I will ask two very brief questions to Claudia and Pramila before giving the floor to Dr. Kang to respond to some of the comments, and then we will open the floor for questions. So if you have already a question, please feel free to put your question on the box, on the chat box, or raise your hand and I will give you the floor. Maybe for Claudia, I think you have touched a lot on the topics that we had in mind for the discussion. And may I ask, maybe since you have a more global perspective from the World Investment Report, if you see certain particularities in the case of Asia, I mean, given the strong linkages to regional value chains or global value chains, what are the particularities that you see in Asia that will be maybe worth considering that are not the same than other regions?
Well, Asia has a lot of a good mix of developed and developing countries or economies, which make it a real good candidate for these regional cooperations agreements, where multinationals can take advantage of this, of participating or locating production sites in some of these economies. The most important is RCEP, which just came about, but also other transnational, trans-Pacific agreements. This is a huge potential, and also technologically is very much advanced. Okay, you still have some least developed countries attracting lower value chains, but for us, as an investment division looking at the trends there, China as well as Japan in the now is a bit in a minor emphasis, is giving really a huge momentum to the development of the region, and through both productive investments, developing a supply chain which is regional, but also through infrastructure investments, through the Belt and Road initiative, which of course it has a lot of criticism and issues related to that, but it all contributes to create a more integrated regions, which is I think one of the strengths of that region. We had been looking at the time of the trade war, US-China trade war, on the impact of FDI into region. In fact, it didn't suffer. It didn't suffer at all. Of course, closures and facilities relocations are difficult to spot, but in general, we didn't see big movements out of the region. So if it wasn't China, it was Vietnam. If it wasn't Vietnam, it was Taiwan. So This, I think, this really strong and close connection of the region and of the economies belonging to that, and plus having economies in different stages of the development gives a strength to the region, as in fact is the region attracting the most FDI in the world. So that I think it makes it unique in the world, in the developing world.
Thanks a lot, and that touches on some of the issues that I wanted to mention regarding RCEP in particular, and that's also a question we had for Pramila. Do you expect RCEP to strengthen or the reshoring trend in the region? And if you could give us a very quick walk on what is happening in RCEP and how this could impact in the region. Over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much. So to be very quick, I will just skip my answer. It just goes straight to an example. Okay. But the quick answer is, I'm sure it can have an effect, but of course it will also depend on the implementation of our SAP, which is only signed now, but not in place. But assuming that there will be an implementation, I'll just show you an example here. So you just imagine you have Republic of Korea exporting lasers to PRC. And those lasers are manufactured from parts coming from Japan or US. As a very simple example, when Korea exports those lasers to PRC, there are two options. They can benefit from preferential treatments through the PRC-Korea agreement, or if the rules of origins are not complied with, or for any other reasons, rules are not complied with, then the MFN tariffs will apply of 6%. Okay, and so the idea is that with our SAP, all these tariffs should normally be reduced to zero, at least after 10 years here in this case. And about the incentives, going straight to the question of reshoring, here it's interesting because the same rule, if you imagine that PRC Korea has specific rules of origin and the exact same rule can apply in our SAP, okay, maybe 40% of non-originating materials, an example. Then the exact same rules can provide different incentives only because of the different coverage of the agreement, meaning that here, when you have RSAP, to benefit from the preferential treatment of RSAP, you need to comply with the same rule of origin, but you benefit from accumulation possibilities. This means that parts that are coming from Japan and that are originating in Japan will be considered as originating also in Korea. And so this means that what you can have is the nearshoring, let's say, incentive for Korea to say, well, because we cannot comply and we cannot benefit from this 2.4%, but we were not able to, to do things differently than import from Japan, then we are stuck with 6%. But we could instead reduce what we import from US and go through Japan, okay, and just keep US. And then automatically, because Japan will be originating also in our SAP, then you will comply with the rule and be able to benefit from the preferential treatment under RSAP. So that's it. It's just to give you this example that the same rule with mega regional, because of the coverage, can have different impacts and different reshoring incentives. And I believe if the application is done properly, then yes, it can change the trade landscape. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pramila. An excellent example just to give an idea of what's happening in RCEP and how this reshoring can be translated into some of the agreements. Okay, so I think we have covered a lot, and I would like now to again open the floor for questions. If you have any question, please feel free to put it on the chat box. In the meantime, I would like maybe Yong Woo to go back to you and give you the floor to react to some of the comments that you have received on the current research and your thoughts on the discussion so far.
Thank you, Rolando, and panelists. Thank you very much for your insightful views and observations made on during this webinar. I may not repeat the very important point you have already made. 2 points quickly. Although we are discussing through our webinar the future of the landscape of the GBC, either into the area of the diversification, reshoring or nearshoring. But at the end of the day, I think that the businesses should be the main player of shaping up the new landscape of the GBC in the future. In that sense, because our monitoring of the GBC landscape is just simply outcome of how different the businesses have played around across different sectors and across borders. So I think in that sense, we will have to, at the government side, we need to think about how to incentivize the businesses to continue to participate into the global value chain. And so that leads to my second point. I mean, this was emphasized by most of the panelists during the webinar, the importance of trade agreement, regional trade agreement and the bilateral trade agreement. Even within the Asia, I think that Asia itself is a very huge, enormous region. I mean, I don't know how much it would take flying from Japan to Georgia, for example. Within the Asia, this is a huge and enormous region. So, for example, not only, I mean, we have seen quite significant progress in terms of sub-regional level, regional integration through the ASEAN level, the ASEAN Economic Community, and the East Asia, some trilateral and bilateral FTAs, and some type of the trade facilitation efforts being made in the Central Asia. But we've not seen yet the more ambitious trade liberalization and the cooperation efforts across different sub-regions, for example. When it comes to the diversifying the risks of the disruptions of the supply chains, referring to the finance, for example, we can think about the 60 to 40% investment between the bond and the equity, but also some kind of barbell strategy, kind of making investment to diversify their portfolios in the items which have the lower correlation, even opposite correlation. In that sense, not only focusing on the free trade agreement with the nearby country, but also some kind of the efforts to have the free trade agreement with the remote, the neighbors within Asia could also be helpful in diversifying the supply chain, the disruption risks for the region, I think. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Yong Woo, for these comments. I have maybe one question. I don't know if it has been discussed, but we have discussed a lot about inventory management. It's something that was mentioned in the presentation. And I come from a background of operations research, so I'm always thinking of inventories. And it's something that we are facing now. Is now the future to have larger inventories? And is that the strategy that might be important?
The question is for me, or so Claudia could answer.
Okay, go ahead, Claudia, and then
no, yeah, but just because I work on companies, on multinationals, yes. Yeah. In fact, the strategies companies have to have a more resilient value chain and supply chain are on the one side the restructuring of the international production network, which is very, very costly and slow and not available in the short term. And then on the short term, there are either risk management operations and actions they can take immediately, and they most probably already took. And one of them is increasing inventory. The other one is using artificial intelligence to manage and control better the supply chain. There is the flexibilization of this old chain. I mean, what the initial shock made clear is that companies had maybe a good idea of their suppliers, but no clue about second and third tier suppliers. So this requires more digital knowledge and also some marketing intelligence into forecasting possible shocks to the company and to the wider market. So these are risk mitigating strategies which are more available and more easy to apply for companies, which I think they're already doing it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Yong Woo, would you like to say something on this?
No, as you have mentioned, the just-in-time inventory management might be transition into the just-in-case inventory management, as we all know, which may entail the greater cost implications. But to safeguard the supply chains, the business may have to pay more cost to secure their supply chains in the future. But we also need to think about the risk management. If there is some disruptions to the supply chain, the cost will be even greater than the cost input into just in case the supply inventory management system. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Well, I think we are running out of time, unfortunately. So I think we have covered a lot, and I've learned a lot personally, and also a lot of questions. Some of my takeaways from this discussion on the domestic shocks mentioned by Roberta, the strategies mentioned by Ioki on FDI and technology, and industrial transition and the incentives also for this type of smoothing of industrial transition, and a lot of the points raised by Claudia on the different and heterogeneous effects across sectors, also vertical across the different levels of MNEs. And finally, Pramila's point, an example on how this is translating into some of the discussions in RCEP and other trade agreements. I would like to, well, before we conclude, let me thank you again. Thank you all our panelists for a very, very insightful discussion, and our audience for their time. And I hope we can continue the discussion in the future. The video and the materials will be available in our website. And we hope to see you also for the next edition for our next webinar series, which will take place on July 23rd, and will cover the topic of fintech and sustainable recovery. So until then, thank you very much again. Thank you to our panelists, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Roberta, Claudia, and Dr. Min.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the invitation again. Thanks. Great.
Thank you very much.